My name is Monica Reeve. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked inside systems that reward visibility more than value. I've been called reliable, dependable, low maintenance, the kind of person managers trust to handle it without supervision. What people rarely call me is ambitious, or difficult, or someone who needs to be watched closely. And for a long time, I thought that was a compliment. If you met me in a meeting, you probably wouldn't notice me first. I'm not the loudest voice in the room. I don't interrupt. I don't have confidence. I listen. I take notes. And when I speak, it's usually to clarify something everyone else missed. That calmness, what some people mistake for softness, became the reason I was underestimated for years. This story isn't about a single bad boss or a dramatic blow-up. There's no shouting match, no viral resignation moment, no revenge fantasy. It's about something quieter and, in many ways, more common. I was the top performer on my team, the person others quietly relied on when things broke, the one whose work showed up in results, but whose name rarely showed up in credit or compensation. And year after year, I never got a raise. Not because I wasn't valuable, not because I didn't deliver, but because I didn't fit the emotional profile of someone who was expected to push back. I didn't make things uncomfortable. I didn't demand attention. And in unfair systems, that can be enough to hold you exactly where you are. This story follows a long emotional arc. It begins with loyalty, real loyalty, the kind that grows when you believe effort will eventually be seen. It moves through confusion, then quiet self-doubt. There were moments when I wondered if I was imagining the imbalance, if gratitude should be enough, if staying calm meant staying small. But this is not a story about resentment building until it explodes. It's about what happens when silence stops being fear and becomes a choice. At some point, I realized that emotion was never going to correct an unfair pay system. Anger would only make me easier to dismiss. So instead of confronting anyone, I started observing, documenting, learning how compensation decisions were actually made, not how they were explained in meetings. What followed wasn't dramatic, it was methodical. Evidence over emotion, pattern over protest. This is a story about psychological reversal, not domination through force. About reclaiming dignity without humiliating anyone. About understanding leverage without announcing it. And about what it means to confront unfair systems in a way that leaves you intact, calm, clear, and unashamed. I'm sharing this not to position myself as a hero and not to paint anyone else as a villain. Systems don't need villains to be unjust. They only need enough people willing to stay quiet for the wrong reasons. So before we go any further, let me ask you something gently, without accusation. Have you ever been valued for what you give, but overlooked when it came time to give back? To them, I was the steady one, not the star, not the visionary, not the risk-taker whose ideas filled whiteboards and meeting agendas. I was the person who made sure things didn't fall apart after the meeting ended. The one who stayed late to clean up loose ends. The one who noticed when a process quietly failed and fixed it before anyone higher up had to know it ever broke. In performance reviews, the language was always warm and vague. Monica is incredibly reliable. Monica is a strong support for the team. Monica can always be counted on. They said it with smiles, sometimes with genuine appreciation. And for a long time, I absorbed those words as proof that I mattered. But here's what I didn't understand back then. Those words described usefulness, not value. In meetings, I was often the person people looked at when something technical got confusing. Someone would say, "Monica, can you sanity check this?" And I would, quietly, accurately. The conversation would move on, smoother now, cleaner, no pause, no acknowledgement beyond a nod. If credit were a currency, I would be donating mine away in small amounts every day. I wasn't ignored in a cruel way. That's important to say. No one excluded me from emails. No one spoke over me aggressively. The invisibility was softer than that, more polite, almost kind. I was included, but never centered. When promotions came up, leadership talked about presence and stakeholder confidence. When raises were discussed, they referenced scope and visibility. Those words floated through meetings without ever landing on my name, even though my work touched nearly every project that mattered. I told myself stories to make sense of it. I told myself I was still early in my career. I told myself consistency would be rewarded eventually. I told myself that not being political was a strength. And most dangerously, I told myself that asking for more pay, more recognition would somehow cheapen the integrity of my work. So I didn't ask. I watched others do it, though. Colleagues with similar titles, similar workloads, and sometimes objectively weaker results. They scheduled meetings. They framed contributions strategically. They used confident language, whereas I used precise language. They got raises. When I noticed the pattern, I didn't feel angry at them. I felt embarrassed by myself, as if I had misunderstood an unspoken rule everyone else seemed to know. The truth is, I was easy to manage. I didn't complain. I didn't threaten to leave. I didn't bring problems without also bringing solutions. From the outside, I looked content, stable, safe. And systems tend to keep safe people exactly where they are. Over time, my role became unofficial but deeply entrenched. If something went wrong, it found its way to me. If a deadline slipped, I absorbed it. If a project needed rescuing, my name came up quietly inside conversations. Monica will know. Monica can handle it. I became a solution, not a person. What's hard to admit is that I participated in this. Not consciously, but consistently. I equated calm with professionalism. I equated endurance with character. I thought that if I just stayed grounded, stayed excellent, stayed patient, the system would correct itself. But systems don't correct what benefits them. To them, I wasn't someone who needed to be incentivized. I was already delivering at a high level, for free, emotionally speaking. There was no urgency around me, no fear of losing me, no pressure to change my compensation. I wasn't overlooked because I was invisible. I was overlooked because I was predictable. And at that stage of my life, I didn't yet understand how dangerous predictability can be when it's paired with silence. The first moment didn't feel important at the time. That's why it stayed with me. It happened during a quarterly review cycle, the kind filled with spreadsheets, neutral language, and polite optimism. I had just finished presenting a summary of our team's performance, numbers I had compiled, cleaned, and double-checked over several late evenings. The metrics were strong, stronger than forecast. Strong enough that the room felt lighter afterward. My manager nodded, smiled, then said something that sounded harmless. This was really a team effort. Everyone murmured agreement. The conversation moved on. I remember sitting there, pen resting against my notebook, waiting for a follow-up that never came. Not praise, not a thank you, just acknowledgement that the work hadn't appeared out of thin air. It didn't come. That was the first small cut. Not the comment itself, but what followed. Or rather, what didn't. Later that week, I had my one-on-one. I didn't plan to bring anything up. I never did. But my manager mentioned compensation in passing, almost casually. "This year's budget is tight," he said. "We're being very careful." I nodded. Of course, everyone was. Then he added, "But you're in a good place. You're stable, consistent." Stable, consistent. The words landed differently this time. not as reassurance, but as explanation. I walked back to my desk feeling unsettled, though I couldn't yet name why. Nothing unfair had technically happened. No promises were broken, no rules violated, and that made it harder to trust my reaction. Over the next few weeks, I noticed more moments like that. Small, almost invisible. A colleague was praised publicly for driving results on a project where I had built the operational framework. My name wasn't mentioned. I told myself it didn't matter. The work mattered. Another time, a junior teammate was fast-tracked for a raise after advocating for herself. People said she was assertive. I was happy for her, truly, and quietly, something tightened in my chest. I didn't talk about it with anyone. There was nothing concrete to complain about, just a growing sense that the math didn't add up. I started replaying conversations in my head, searching for something I might have missed. A signal, a warning, but everything had been polite, professional, reasonable. That's what made it confusing. The system wasn't hostile. It was comfortable. And comfort can be disarming. When I finally looked at my compensation history, I did it out of curiosity, not accusation. I lined up dates, percentages, and performance ratings. I expected to see gradual growth. Instead, I saw stagnation, flat lines where there should have been steps. I closed the document quickly, like I had opened something private by mistake. My instinct wasn't to confront anyone. It was to doubt myself. Maybe I hadn't communicated my impact clearly enough. Maybe raises were more about timing than performance. Maybe this was just how it worked. Everyone else seemed unbothered. That made me feel foolish for being bothered at all. So I swallowed it. I told myself this was a one-off, a budget year, a minor oversight. I told myself not to become that person who fixates on money instead of meaning. But the cut had already been made. Small, clean, and easy to ignore. Until it wasn't. Because once you notice the first imbalance, you start seeing the others. And even when no one else reacts, your body remembers. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic changed. That was the problem. The days continued in their familiar rhythm. Meetings, deliverables, deadlines. People were still polite. My manager still trusted me. I was still included. On the surface, everything looked normal enough that questioning it felt almost inappropriate. So I adjusted, not outwardly, inwardly. I told myself that feeling unsettled was a phase, that every workplace had uneven moments, that professionalism meant not reacting to every internal discomfort. And slowly, almost without noticing, I began to normalize what should have concerned me. It showed up in how feedback was delivered. My reviews stayed consistently positive but non-specific. Phrases like meets expectations followed me year after year, even as my responsibilities quietly expanded. I was trusted with more complexity, more risk, more cleanup, without a change in title or pay. When I noticed the mismatch, I reframed it. They trust me, I thought. This is growth, I told myself. Visibility will come later. Later became a convenient word, flexible, indefinite. I watched meetings where decisions were made based on insights I had provided privately beforehand. When those insights were repeated out loud by someone else, I stayed quiet. Correcting the record felt petty, interruptive, emotional. So I smiled, took notes, let it pass. At some point, I realized I was doing something subtle but dangerous. I was translating disrespect into responsibility. If someone overlooked my contribution, I assumed I hadn't communicated clearly enough. If my workload increased without compensation, I assumed I had proven myself capable. If others advanced faster, I assumed they had played the game better, not that the game itself was flawed. That framing kept me calm. It also kept me stuck. What made it harder was that no single moment was bad enough to justify confrontation. There was no line crossed, no email I could forward and say, this is the problem. It was a pattern built from small omissions. And patterns are easy to ignore when you benefit from being seen as agreeable. I began to notice how often I softened my own language, how I prefaced ideas with, this might be wrong, or just a thought, how I thanked people for things they were supposed to do, how I apologized when asking clarifying questions. None of this was asked of me explicitly. I offered it freely, believing it made collaboration smoother. What I didn't see then was how it also made me easier to dismiss. When compensation conversations came up at a company-wide level, they were framed as complex, sensitive, and almost taboo. Leadership spoke about fairness in abstract terms, equity as philosophy, not practice. I absorbed that too. I told myself money wasn't the point, that I cared about impact, that being trusted mattered more than being paid more. That story worked until it didn't. Because there is a quiet erosion that happens when effort and recognition drift too far apart. You don't become angry, you become tired, not physically, existentially. I noticed it in small ways, how I hesitated before volunteering, how I felt a flicker of resentment I immediately shut down, how I stopped imagining myself staying long-term, even though I had no plan to leave. Still, I stayed quiet. Silence had become my default coping mechanism, not because I was afraid, but because I had convinced myself that speaking would make things worse, that it would introduce emotion into a system that rewarded composure. So I kept the peace. And the system rewarded me for that too, by expecting it. What I didn't realize yet was that by normalizing the imbalance, I was teaching people how to treat me. Not through words, but through consistency. Disrespect doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles in slowly, disguised as trust, framed as professionalism, and justified as patience. And once it becomes normal, breaking that normal feels like disruption, even when it's long overdue. It took time before I understood that I wasn't just being overlooked. I had been assigned a role. Not formally, not in any document or job description. It was quieter than that, a shared understanding that lived in habits, expectations, and unspoken boundaries. I was the reliable one, the stabilizer, the person who made everyone else look more competent by absorbing the uncertainty they didn't want to carry. When something needed to be done without drama, it came to me. When a project required patience, precision, and follow-through, my name surfaced. Often without discussion, as if it were obvious. Monica will take care of it. At first, that felt like trust. Later, it felt like containment. I began to see how others' roles were protected in ways mine wasn't. Some people were shielded from messy tasks so they could focus on strategy. Others were encouraged to take risks, even fail publicly, because it built their leadership profile. My role was different. I was there to ensure continuity, to reduce friction, to make transitions seamless. And continuity, I learned, is rarely rewarded. It's expected. The clearest sign came when a new initiative launched, high visibility, executive attention, the kind of project that accelerated careers. I had helped design the operational backbone for it weeks earlier, but when assignments were made, I was asked to support from the side. "You're so good at keeping things running," my manager said. "We need that stability." Stability. The word landed like a label, one that justified why I wasn't being moved forward. Why did my compensation stay static? Why is my role expanded horizontally but never vertically? I didn't argue. I nodded. I understood the logic, or at least I told myself I did. But something shifted internally. I started to notice how rarely people checked in with me about my goals, how assumptions were made about my availability, my capacity, my willingness, how my calmness was interpreted as consent. I was the person you could rely on not to disrupt the system, and systems love that. There's a particular invisibility that comes with being competent and agreeable. You become the background infrastructure, critical but unseen, appreciated only when something breaks. I wasn't angry yet, but I was becoming aware. Aware that the role I was playing served everyone else more than it served me. Aware that no one was going to reassign me unless I did something to change the pattern. Aware that being indispensable in the wrong way is a liability. What made it complicated was that I still cared. About the work, about the people, about doing things well. I didn't want to burn bridges or prove a point. I just wanted fairness. But fairness, I was beginning to understand, doesn't emerge on its own, especially not in systems that quietly benefit from your restraint. So I began to pull back, not dramatically, not visibly, just enough to observe. I stopped immediately fixing things that weren't officially mine. I paid attention to how decisions were made when I wasn't smoothing the edges. I watched how credit moved, how money moved. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. What if this role wasn't something I earned, but something I accepted? That question didn't make me reckless. It made me careful. Because once you see the role you've been assigned, you can no longer pretend neutrality. You're either going to keep performing it or you're going to change the terms. And I wasn't ready to change them yet, but I was no longer asleep. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no meeting, no raised voice, no decisive moment where everything suddenly became clear. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I was alone in a small conference room reviewing a compensation planning document that had been shared with managers by mistake. It wasn't labeled confidential, but it wasn't meant for me. I knew that immediately. The language was different, less polished, more honest. I didn't feel excited when I opened it. I felt still. The document outlined salary bands, adjustment rationales, and, most strikingly, risk categories. Employees were grouped not just by performance, but by the likelihood of pushback, retention risk, negotiation probability. There it was, in neutral corporate language. Some people were expected to ask for more. Others weren't. I didn't need to see my name to know where I fell. What surprised me wasn't the existence of the system. I had suspected as much. What surprised me was how unemotional it all was. No malice, no judgment, just assumptions, quietly shaping outcomes. I closed the document and sat back in my chair. For a moment, I felt something like grief. Not for the money, but for the version of myself that believed fairness would arrive through patience alone. That version of me had been sincere, hardworking, earnest, and wrong. That was the day something shifted, not externally, but internally. I realized I had been treating my silence as a virtue when in reality it was being read as permission. No one was waiting for me to speak up. They were counting on me not to. That understanding didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I didn't rush to HR. I didn't confront my manager. I didn't even tell a friend. Emotion would have clouded what I was beginning to see clearly. Instead, I asked myself a simple question. If this system is built on assumptions, what happens if those assumptions change? That's when I stopped seeing myself as trapped and started seeing myself as positioned. I looked at my work differently, not as proof of loyalty, but as data. I began noting which processes depended on me, which decisions flowed through my analysis, and which outcomes would quietly degrade if I stepped back. I also began separating my self-worth from my output. That was harder. It required sitting with discomfort instead of resolving it through overwork. For the first time, I allowed myself not to be immediately useful. Nothing collapsed, no one panicked, and that too was information. I realized that my fear of causing disruption had been exaggerated. The system would adapt, it always does, but adaptation has a cost, and I was finally willing to acknowledge that cost had value. The shift wasn't about confrontation, it was about orientation. I stopped asking, how do I prove my value? And started asking, where does my value already exist and who knows it? That change was quiet, but it was irreversible. I walked back to my desk that day feeling lighter, not heavier. Not because anything had improved yet, but because I was no longer confused. Clarity is a strange kind of relief. It doesn't fix anything immediately, but it removes the self-blame. It replaces emotion with understanding. And once that happens, silence stops being something that happens to you. It becomes something you choose. After that day, I didn't suddenly become outspoken. I didn't change my tone or announce a new boundary. From the outside, I looked exactly the same. But internally, my silence had changed shape. Before, I stayed quiet because I didn't want to disrupt harmony, because I believed patience was professionalism, because I thought being agreeable protected me. Now I stayed quiet because I was watching. There's a difference between silence as fear and silence as strategy. One drains you, the other sharpens you. I stopped volunteering explanations for things people hadn't asked about. I let pauses exist in meetings instead of filling them. When decisions were made that ignored my earlier input, I didn't rush to correct them. I noted the outcome. This wasn't passive-aggressive. It was observational. I began tracking patterns the way I tracked metrics, calmly, without judgment. Who spoke up and was rewarded? Who took credit and was believed? Who was assumed to be satisfied? And most importantly, who was never asked? I noticed how often leadership framed compensation as a reaction rather than a responsibility. Raises happened after pressure, not performance. Adjustments followed discomfort, not contribution. Silence in that context was interpreted as consent, and consent has consequences. People began to assume I was content with my role. I valued stability over growth, that I didn't want more. They said it kindly, almost protectively. She's solid where she is. She doesn't seem like the type to push for money. I heard these things secondhand. I didn't correct them, because correcting them prematurely would have cost me leverage. Instead, I refined my understanding of the system. I learned how budgets were approved, how exceptions were made, and how narratives were constructed around compensation decisions. I listened more than I spoke. I also started documenting quietly, not emotionally, not obsessively, just accurately. Dates, deliverables, outcomes, dependencies, instances where my work directly prevented losses or enabled gains. I didn't frame them as achievements. I framed them as facts. At the same time, I reduced the invisible labor, the uncredited fixes, the behind-the-scenes rescues, not all at once, just enough to reveal where gaps actually existed. People didn't interpret this as resistance. They interpreted it as bandwidth, and that was useful. Because when you stop cushioning a system, it begins to show its pressure points. Still, no one confronted me. No one accused me of pulling back. The assumption held, if I had a problem, I would say something. They were wrong. I was saying something, just not out loud. This phase required discipline. There were moments when I wanted to speak, to clarify, to defend, to explain. But I had learned that explanations without leverage are just noise. So I stayed composed. I reminded myself that my goal wasn't to be seen as right. It was to be taken seriously. And seriousness, I had learned, comes from preparation, not performance. Silence became a container for focus, for planning, for choice. And the more I observed, the clearer it became. The system wasn't going to change unless something it relied on changed first. I didn't yet know what that would be. But I was no longer afraid to find out. While everything looked the same on the surface, something fundamental was changing underneath, and no one noticed. That wasn't because I was hiding anything, it was because they weren't looking. When people believe they understand you, they stop paying attention. They stop updating their assumptions. And I had been classified a long time ago: dependable, low risk, not going anywhere. That classification gave me room. I began to prepare, but not in the way people imagine preparation. There was no secret plan pinned to my wall, no dramatic countdown, just a steady accumulation of clarity. I mapped my work the way an auditor would, not just what I did, but what depended on it. Which teams waited for my input? Which decisions stalled without my analysis? Which processes had quietly been built around my availability? I noticed something unsettling. Much of what I handled was undocumented by design. Institutional knowledge, informal checkpoints, invisible safeguards, things that just worked because I was there. I had mistaken that for job security. It wasn't security, it was fragility. And fragility cuts both ways. I started studying compensation frameworks, externally and internally. Market benchmarks, role inflation, how titles lag responsibilities. I learned how companies justify pay gaps without explicitly acknowledging them. Words like impact, scope, and complexity were elastic. They stretched or contracted depending on who was being discussed. I didn't argue with that. I learned to speak it fluently. At the same time, I documented outcomes that were hard to dismiss. Cost savings are tied to my decisions. Risks mitigated. Timelines compressed, not as achievements, but as causal chains. Because this happened, that didn't. That language mattered. I also paid attention to exits. Who left the company and how leadership responded. Which departures triggered panic? Which were quietly absorbed? Which roles took months to replace? Patterns emerged. High visibility roles were mourned loudly. Infrastructure roles were missed silently, but deeply. And I sat squarely in the second category. What they never noticed was how carefully I was separating my identity from my role. I stopped anchoring my sense of worth to being needed. I practiced letting small things fail when they weren't mine to save. The first time I did it, my stomach tightened. I expected fallout. Instead, someone else stepped in, inefficiently, noisily, visibly. They were praised for taking initiative. That's when it fully clicked. Effort and recognition were not correlated. Visibility was. So I stopped donating invisible effort. I also began positioning, not upward, but outward. Building relationships beyond my immediate team. Learning how my work translates outside the company. Quietly validating my market value without announcing dissatisfaction. No one noticed that either, because dissatisfaction had a look, and I didn't wear it. I stayed calm, professional, engaged. That calmness was still misread as contentment. And that misreading protected me, because preparation requires time, and time is easiest to take when no one suspects change. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't plotting collapse. I was simply removing my dependence on a system that had already decided how much I was worth. What they never noticed was that my silence had become spacious, not empty. It held data, options, leverage. And once you have leverage, you don't rush. You wait until it matters. The reveal didn't happen in a meeting. There was no dramatic discovery, no sudden email that changed everything. It happened privately, quietly, in a way that only changed things for me. By that point, I had gathered enough information to stop guessing. I knew how my role compared to the market. I knew how compensation decisions were framed internally. And I knew with uncomfortable certainty that my pay had nothing to do with my performance. It was about risk, not business risk, personal risk, the risk that I would challenge the system, That realization came one evening as I reviewed two documents side by side. One was a market compensation report for roles nearly identical to mine. The other was an internal planning summary outlining future staffing costs. The numbers didn't just differ, they told a story. Externally, my role was valued significantly higher than what I was paid. Internally, the company had already budgeted for someone at that higher rate, just not for me. They weren't unaware of the gap. They were managing it. And suddenly, everything made sense. The praise without promotion, the expanded scope without adjustment, the constant reassurance is paired with immobility. I wasn't underpaid because I was invisible. I was underpaid because I was reliable. Reliable people don't force recalculations. That was the private reveal. Not that the system was unfair, but that it was rational, in a way that didn't include my interest. And that clarity did something unexpected. It removed the emotion. There was no spike of anger, no sense of betrayal, just a clean understanding. This wasn't personal, and it wasn't going to fix itself. I didn't feel small. I felt awake. I saw my situation the way a negotiator sees a contract that has expired but is still being honored out of habit by only one side. And I stopped honoring it. Not outwardly, internally. I stopped thinking of my compensation as something to be granted and started seeing it as something to be corrected or exited from. That shift was subtle but decisive. I didn't celebrate this realization. I didn't share it. I didn't even write it down. Some insights lose power when spoken too early. Instead, I sat with it. I let it settle into my body, into my posture, into how I listened during meetings, into how carefully I chose when to engage and when to stay quiet. I realized that leverage doesn't announce itself. It waits until it's undeniable. The private reveal wasn't about exposing anyone else. It was about exposing a truth I had avoided. Staying comfortable was costing me more than leaving would. And for the first time, leaving didn't feel like failure. It felt like alignment. I looked around my desk that night, the notebook, the screens, the systems I had helped stabilize. I felt no bitterness, just a calm awareness that I had outgrown the role I was being allowed to play. They didn't know that yet, and that was okay, because the next decision wouldn't require their permission. Once you see the truth clearly, there's a moment where you still have a choice. Not between right and wrong, but between comfort and consequence. I stood at that decision point longer than I like to admit. Not because I was confused, but because I understood what each option would cost me. I could stay. Staying meant predictability, respect without advancement, a role I knew how to perform flawlessly. It meant continued praise, stable income, and the quiet erosion I had already learned to live with. I could ask. That option looked reasonable on the surface. Schedule a meeting, present my case, frame it calmly. I had the data. I could make the argument. But I also knew the unspoken risk. Asking would reclassify me from low risk to needs management, from reliable to inconvenient. And if the answer was no, or worse, a symbolic adjustment, it would confirm what I already knew while narrowing my future options. Or I could leave, not impulsively, not angrily, strategically. Leaving meant uncertainty. It meant letting go of the identity I had built there. It meant stepping into a market that didn't know me yet. But it also meant reclaiming authorship over my own value. What made the decision irreversible wasn't logic. It was dignity. I realized that staying silent while knowing the truth would turn my composure into self-betrayal. That asking for fairness in a system that benefited from my silence would still position me as a supplicant. And I was done asking to be recognized for what I already was. So I chose the option that changed the equation entirely. I chose to prepare my exit without announcing it. That choice didn't make me reckless. It made me focused. I didn't disengage emotionally from my work, but I disengaged from the fantasy that loyalty would be rewarded retroactively. I did my job well, cleanly, fully, but no longer at the cost of my future. I updated my understanding of my worth externally. I tested the market discreetly. I listened more than I spoke. I noticed how differently I was treated when compensation was assumed rather than negotiated. Those conversations didn't inflate my ego, they stabilized my resolve. I wasn't asking for more than I deserved. I had simply been giving more than I was paid for. The decision point clarified something else, too. Confrontation wasn't necessary for closure. You don't always need acknowledgement from the system you're leaving. Sometimes the most honest response is withdrawal, not as punishment, as alignment. I didn't frame this as proving them wrong. I framed it as choosing myself without explanation. That mattered, because revenge requires an audience. Integrity doesn't. When the decision finally settled, it felt quiet, anticlimactic almost. No rush of adrenaline, no fear spike. Just a steady sense that I was no longer negotiating against myself. The path forward was set, not in anger, but in clarity. And once that happens, you don't look for permission to move. You move. Once the decision was made, my behavior didn't change in any way that would raise alarms. That was intentional. I kept showing up on time. I met deadlines. I contributed in meetings when it was necessary. I didn't withdraw emotionally or visibly disengage. From the outside, I looked exactly as I always had. That consistency was my cover. Behind it, I began moving carefully, quietly, through a series of practical, almost mundane steps that together changed everything. First, I stopped anchoring my calendar to the company's urgency. I protected my energy. I declined meetings that had no clear purpose. I asked for agendas, not confrontationally, professionally. The subtle shift reduced my availability without anyone being able to object. Then I formalized what had never been formal. I documented processes that lived only in my head. Not all of them, just enough to remove single points of failure while still revealing how much invisible labor had been propping things up. Documentation changes power dynamics. It turns "Monica will handle it" into "who owns this now?" I noticed people becoming slightly less relaxed, not worried, just less certain. The system had grown used to me smoothing over gaps without acknowledgement. Now gaps had names. At the same time, I separated myself financially. I reviewed contracts, updated personal savings buffers, calculated how long I could walk away without panic. This wasn't dramatic preparation, it was adult responsibility. Freedom requires margin. I also became careful about what I shared. I stopped previewing insights early. I delivered finished work, not half-formed solutions. That changed how my contributions landed. They became harder to reframe, harder to absorb without attribution. Still, no one noticed, because people rarely notice stability until it's gone. I scheduled conversations externally during lunch breaks and early mornings. Nothing secretive, just private. I didn't vent, I didn't criticize my employer. I spoke about scope, outcomes, and experience. The response was consistent. Your role sounds bigger than your title. That compensation seems misaligned. No outrage, just recognition. That recognition didn't make me feel vindicated. It made me feel grounded. Like I wasn't imagining things. Like the math made sense everywhere except where I currently was. I didn't rush. Moving in silence means resisting the urge to accelerate once you see a way out. I waited for the right alignment, not the fastest escape. Meanwhile, inside the company, subtle consequences began to appear. Small delays, questions that used to come to me now bounced around longer. Decisions took more meetings. Nothing broke, but nothing flowed quite as smoothly. Still, no one panicked. Not yet. I hadn't removed myself. I had simply stopped compensating for structural blind spots. And that distinction mattered. Because when the system finally reacted, it wouldn't be to my emotion. It would be too absent. I didn't announce my dissatisfaction because dissatisfaction invites negotiation. I was no longer negotiating. I was transitioning, quietly, completely, on my terms. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They arrived in confusion. At first, it showed up in small questions. Emails asking for clarification on things I used to anticipate before they were asked. Meetings where people circled the same issue without landing anywhere. I answered when it was appropriate. I didn't withhold information. I didn't sabotage anything. I simply responded to what was asked. No more, no less. That shift alone changed the tempo. People began to feel it before they could name it. Projects took longer. Dependencies became visible. The quiet efficiency I had provided was no longer cushioning every transition. Still, no one connected it to me. Why would they? I was still there, still calm, still doing my job. What they felt was loss without a face. My manager started checking in more frequently, not urgently, just with a new attentiveness. Everything okay? You seem busy lately. I smiled, said I was fine. I was. Other teams began escalating things that had never needed escalation before. Decisions that once moved through me smoothly now required alignment meetings, approvals, and explanations. The system was adjusting and discovering friction. I watched all of this with a kind of detached empathy, not satisfied, not resentment, just understanding. Because this was never about proving my importance, it was about revealing it. And revealed importance changes behavior. There was a meeting, unremarkable on the surface, where someone finally said it out loud. "We're missing something," they said. "Things aren't connecting the way they used to." No one looked at me. No one accused. The statement hung in the room, unresolved. I didn't fill the silence. That was new. I noticed a shift in how people spoke to me. More direct, more careful, fewer assumptions. They started looping me in earlier again, not because I demanded it, but because the absence of my early involvement had been felt. Still, no one mentioned compensation, and that told me everything. The system was willing to adjust workflows, meeting structures, communication patterns, anything except the part that required reevaluating me. That's when I knew my decision had been right. Because fairness that only appears when productivity declines isn't fairness. It's damage control. Behind the scenes, I continued moving forward. Conversations progressed, options solidified. My exit timeline became clear, not rushed, not delayed. Not inside, the tone subtly shifted. Leadership began speaking more about retention, about knowledge transfer, about capacity planning, words that usually arrive too late. My manager asked me about my long-term goals. It was the first time in years. I answered honestly, but not fully. I spoke about growth, alignment, challenge, all true, none revealing. I wasn't being evasive. I was being precise, because by then, the consequences were already in motion. Not as punishment, but as math. Remove an unacknowledged load-bearing piece and the structure has to redistribute weight. That redistribution creates strain. What surprised me most was how quickly the narrative shifted, not toward accountability, but toward concern. They weren't worried about me leaving yet. They were worried about the complexity increasing. And complexity is expensive. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, because this wasn't chaos. It was a correction. By the time the concern turned into urgency, the window for simple solutions had already closed. It didn't happen with an announcement. It happened with tone. Meetings became tighter. Emails became more careful. Decisions that used to be deferred were suddenly flagged as high priority. There was a subtle recalibration underway, an attempt to stabilize something that no longer moved the way it used to. That's when the questions changed. Not, are you okay? But, what would you need to stay engaged long term? The question came during a one-on-one, delivered gently, almost tentatively, as if the answer might bruise something fragile. I didn't respond immediately. Not because I wanted to make a point, but because I knew the truth would require more than reassurance. By then, leadership had begun to notice downstream effects: timelines slipping, increased handoffs. The cost of redundancy is creeping upward. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to trigger attention. And attention finally was on me. They started referencing my contributions more explicitly, naming them in meetings, thanking me publicly. Small gestures, but deliberate. I recognized them for what they were: signals, not of appreciation, but of recalculation. Soon after, compensation entered the conversation, carefully, indirectly. We're reviewing structures. There may be flexibility. We want to make sure people feel valued. The language was familiar. I had heard versions of it before, just never addressed to me. And that was the moment I understood something clearly. The system wasn't incapable of change. It was simply uninterested until the cost of inaction exceeded the cost of adjustment. By then, my path forward was already in motion. I listened politely. I asked clarifying questions. I acknowledged the intent. But internally, something had already settled. Fixing it now wouldn't be justice, it would be retention. And retention wasn't what I needed. What I needed was alignment between my values and my environment, between what I contributed and how it was recognized, between who I had become and the role I was allowed to occupy. Those conversations came too late, not because I was unforgiving, but because I was no longer undecided. They asked what would make me stay. I didn't answer with a number. I answered with honesty. I've learned a lot here, I said, but I'm at a point where I need to grow in ways this role can't support. It was true, and it was final. There was a pause, the kind that holds regret without assigning blame. I could see the realization settling in, not dramatically, but deeply. That's what they were trying to fix that had taken years to break. Those quick adjustments couldn't undo long-term misalignment. They offered more clarity, more scope, a future conversation. I declined gently, not because the offer wasn't real, but because it was reactive. And I had already chosen to be proactive. Leaving wasn't an act of defiance. It was a response to timing, to patterns, the information I couldn't unsee. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clean. Because sometimes the most painful consequence isn't someone leaving, it's realizing that staying would have required seeing them sooner. By the time they did, I was already gone, internally. The rest was just logistics. The final conversation wasn't dramatic. It didn't deserve to be. It happened in a quiet office with the door half closed, late in the afternoon. No raised voices, no accusations. Just two people sitting across from each other, aware that something was ending. They asked if there was anything they could have done differently. I considered the question carefully, not because I wanted to protect them, but because I wanted to answer truthfully without turning the moment into a verdict. Yes, I said earlier. That was it. No list, no lecture, no replaying of missed raises or overlooked contributions. Those details were already understood. Rehashing them would have shifted the tone from clarity to defense. And defense wasn't my goal. I explained calmly that I had consistently delivered beyond my role while remaining compensation static. That I had watched patterns emerge. That I had reached a point where continuing would mean accepting a version of myself I no longer recognized. I didn't use the word unfair. I didn't need to. I spoke in timelines, in outcomes, in alignment. There was no argument, because there was no heat to argue against. They acknowledged the gap. They admitted assumptions had been made, not malicious ones, convenient ones. That honesty mattered, but it didn't change the outcome. Because accountability doesn't require someone to feel bad, it requires change at the right time. And the right time had passed. What struck me most was the absence of hostility. No one tried to discredit my experience. No one questioned my value. In fact, the opposite. They told me how important I had been, how much they would miss my steadiness, how difficult it would be to replace the institutional knowledge I carried. I thanked them, not sarcastically, sincerely, because the recognition was real, even if it was late. I explained that my decision wasn't about anger, it was about self-respect, about choosing not to renegotiate a contract that had already shaped me into someone smaller than I wanted to be. That framing changed the energy in the room. This wasn't a confrontation seeking dominance. It was a boundary being honored. I left that meeting without adrenaline, without regret, without the urge to explain myself further. There was nothing left to prove. The power in that moment didn't come from what I said. It came from what I didn't need to say anymore. I walked out knowing that I had handled it the way I wanted to be remembered, composed, clear, and intact. Quiet dominance isn't about winning the argument. It's about leaving the room without carrying anyone else's discomfort with you. After I left, there was no dramatic reinvention. No sudden confidence montage. No version of myself looked unrecognizable in the mirror. What changed was quieter than that. I stopped bracing. For a long time, I had been holding parts of myself in check. My expectations, my curiosity, my sense of proportion. I had learned to compress my needs so they would fit inside a system that never fully expanded to meet me. When I stepped out of it, the relief wasn't euphoric. It was stabilizing. I moved into work where my scope and compensation were aligned from the beginning. Not perfectly, no system is, but honestly. Conversations about value were explicit, not implied. Expectations were named, boundaries were assumed, not negotiated under pressure. That alone changed how I showed up. I spoke the same way I always had. Measured, thoughtful, precise. But now those traits were interpreted differently, not as passivity, but as discernment. Not as compliance, but as confidence without spectacle. I didn't become louder. I became clearer. What surprised me most was how little bitterness I carried with me. I had expected some residue, resentment maybe, or the urge to tell the story as a warning. Instead, I felt neutral. That neutrality wasn't indifference. It was integration. The experience no longer needed to be justified or resolved. It had already taught me what it came to teach. I stopped equating being needed with being valued. I stopped mistaking calmness for safety. I stopped believing that fairness arrives on its own. Those lessons didn't harden me. They refined me. I became more selective about where I invested effort, more intentional about what I made visible, more honest with myself about what I was willing to tolerate. And I learned something else, something that took time to settle. You don't owe loyalty to systems that benefit from your silence. You don't owe explanations to people who only listen when it's inconvenient. And you don't need anger to justify leaving. I still believe in professionalism. I still believe in doing good work. I still believe in composure. But now those values are paired with boundaries. I no longer confuse endurance with integrity or patience with purpose. Who I am now isn't someone who dominates rooms or commands attention. I don't need to. I am someone who understands leverage, not as a weapon, but as awareness. Someone who knows that dignity is not something you demand at the end of a conversation. It's something you build into the terms from the start. Quiet dominance isn't about being underestimated and then revealing your power. It's about never outsourcing your worth to people who haven't learned how to see it. And once you understand that, You don't need closure from the past. You carry clarity forward. If there's one thing I want to leave you with, it's this. Unfair systems rarely announce themselves as unfair. They don't shout. They don't threaten. They don't even deny your value outright. More often, they thank you while keeping you exactly where you are. They reward calm with stagnation, reliability with silence. And if you're someone who takes pride in doing things well, without needing applause, that can be especially dangerous. For a long time, I believed that emotion was the enemy of fairness, that staying composed meant staying professional. And in many ways, that's true. But what I misunderstood was this. Suppressed clarity is just as harmful as unchecked emotion. This story wasn't about me finally speaking up in a meeting. It wasn't about a perfectly worded negotiation. It wasn't even about getting a raise. It was about learning that evidence speaks more clearly than outrage, and that systems respond to leverage, not loyalty. Confronting unfair pay systems doesn't require you to become someone you're not. You don't have to be louder, or colder, or more aggressive. You don't have to embarrass anyone or burn bridges to reclaim your dignity. You need information, you need patterns, you need timing, and most importantly, you need the willingness to stop negotiating against yourself. If you recognize parts of yourself in this story, the dependable one, the calm one, the person who holds things together while being told to be patient, I want you to hear this clearly. Your silence is not invisible, it's being interpreted. The question is whether it's being interpreted in your favor. Quiet dominance isn't about winning after being wronged. It's about refusing to stay in arrangements that require you to minimize yourself to function. Sometimes the most powerful confrontation is the one where you don't raise your voice at all, where you simply change the terms or leave the table entirely. And that doesn't make you disloyal. It makes you awake. Before I go, I want to ask you something, genuinely, without judgment or expectation. Have you ever realized you were being valued for what you give, but not for what it costs you? If you're comfortable, I'd love to hear your experience in the comments. Not to compare pain or assign blame, but to name patterns that are easier to dismantle when they're no longer silent. Thank you for listening.